Section 6. Justice as an Artificial Virtue. Keynes criticizes both Hume and Hutcheson on the nature of obligation, but his objection to the former need only be mentioned in passing. It is simply that sympathy is insufficient to the task. It is far too faint a principle to control our irregular appetites and passions. His criticism of Hutcheson, however, is very instructive, in that it clarifies the nature of the problem that justice, in particular, poses for moral sense theory. The problem with Hutcheson's account of obligation, he says, is its failure to measure up to the facts. This account falls far short of the whole idea of obligation and leaves no distinction betwixt it and a simple approbation or disapprobation of the moral sense, feelings that attend many actions, which by no means come under the notion of obligation or duty. In particular, Hutcheson's problem is that he founds the morality of actions on a certain quality of actions, which procures approbation and love to the agent. But this account of morality is imperfect, because it excludes justice and everything which may be strictly called duty. The man who, confining himself to strict duty, is true to his word, and avoids harming others, is a just and moral man, is entitled to some share of esteem, but he will never be the object of love or friendship. Keynes' point is that justice, principally avoiding harm to others, is an essential part of morals. But the moral sense theory cannot explain our obligation to justice, since justice is without moral beauty. For this reason, the just man will never be the object of love or friendship. Objects of love or friendship are pleasing perceptions, but the perception of justice is not pleasing, even though the perception of injustice is very displeasing, because justice is action solely from duty, not from any benevolent motive. The problem, then, is this: if justice does not procure the approbation of the moral sense, what is the foundation of its approval? What is our motive to just actions? This is the same problem faced by Hutcheson when addressing the question of the external rights. External rights imply moral duties unaccompanied by moral beauty. So what is the source of our approval of them? Keynes's question about justice is thus Hutcheson's external rights problem generalized. Hume recognizes the problem and clearly understands it in just these terms, because he addresses it by considering Hutcheson's example of external rights. When I relieve persons in distress, my natural humanity is my motive. But if we examine all the questions that come before any tribunal of justice, we shall find that, considering each case apart, it would as often be an instance of humanity to decide contrary to the laws of justice as conformable to them. Judges take from a poor man to give to a rich. They bestow on the dissolute the labor of the industries, and they put into the hands of the vicious the means of harming both themselves and others. The whole scheme, however, of law and justice is advantageous to the society and to every individual, and 'twas with a view to this advantage that men, by their voluntary conventions, established it. Hume does not dispute the advantage, and thus the virtue, of justice. The problem is that, because many individual acts of justice lack moral beauty, the moral sense theory finds itself unable to explain the motivation, and thus the obligation, to be just. It thus suffers from a special case of the general problem afflicting rationalist moral theories. And since individual men and women do perform just acts, including those which are entirely lacking in moral beauty, there is a motivation to be just, and which, therefore, must be explained. The human will is moved to perform just acts, despite the fact that there is no original instinct available to do the job. So the problem of justice can be set out as follows. Justice cannot be a natural virtue because there is no natural inclination, and thus no natural obligation, to be just. It is, however, a genuine virtue because it is founded on a real obligation. The reality of the obligation is demonstrated simply by the existence of just actions themselves. So Hume's task is to explain how this real obligation arises. The immediate obligation to perform acts of justice is evident. It is the sense of justice, the sense of duty. However, this sense cannot found justice, since it arises only where justice already exists. It can no more found justice than a sense of morals can found morality itself. The founding principle or obligation which establishes a virtue must be some motive to produce it, distinct from the senses of its morality. The problem of the motivation to be just is that there is no such distinct motives to just acts. Hutcheson's remedy was to appeal to a more extensive benevolence, the good of mankind as a system. To Hume, however, this is not enough, since that is a motive too remote and too sublime to affect the generality of mankind. He adds, "In general, it may be affirmed that there is no such passion in human minds as the love of mankind, merely as such, independent of personal qualities, of services, or of relation to ourself. In fact, the partiality of our affections restricts even our benevolence to a fairly limited sphere. But the natural insecurity of external goods, in particular, makes a system of justice absolutely necessary to the security of society. How, then, is this obstacle to justice overcome? Not by any natural, i.e., original means. In vain should we expect to find in uncultivated nature a remedy to this inconvenience, or hope for any inartificial principle of human mind, which might control those partial affections, and make us overcome the temptations arising from our circumstances. If no natural means can effect the establishment of justice, but social harmony requires that justice to be established, which is shown by the fact of the existence of a system of justice, some sort of non-natural or artificial means must be employed. The obvious candidate is reason. So Hume concludes that the artificial virtues are established by rational reflection on the advantages they provide for securing peaceful social life. In the case of the artificial virtue of justice, Hume offers the following explanation. Rational reflection on the natural instability of the possession of external goods, and on the great advantages that flow from overcoming this instability and securing to individuals the fruits of their industry, a necessary task if the additional force, ability, and security made possible by social life is to be preserved, shows the necessity of establishing rules of property. In this way, justice becomes established despite the absence of a natural motive to perform just acts. The remedy, then, is not derived from nature, but from artifice. Or more properly speaking, nature provides a remedy in the judgment and understanding for what is irregular and incommodious in the affections. So the system of justice is generated by and founded in rational reflection concerning the necessary supports for the social life, a life which is itself necessary because of the great advantages it procures for human life. The product of rational artifice, justice, is an artificial virtue. Hume's account of justice is thus thoroughly in tune with the natural jurists. In the older vocabulary, his position is simply that justice is a dictate of right reason because necessary for sociability and self-preservation. The advantages that the establishment of property procures for social life are so considerable that it cannot be resisted, and in this sense it is a necessary development. Among these advantages, the encouragement given to industry and labor looms large, especially in the political essays, and shows Hume to have adopted and extended the political economy that is an increasingly prominent feature in the theories of his predecessors. The advantages taken as a whole are so overwhelming that, he concludes in the treatise, it is not improper to call property a law of nature. Although not the fruit of an original instinct in human nature, human society cannot prosper without it. So in this sense it is inseparable from the species. The same is also true of other artificial virtues, fidelity and allegiance to government, and so the artificial virtues can all be truly described as dictates of right reason. In this respect, they all satisfy the central requirement of a law of nature, and it is only Hume's preoccupation with the sources of moral action, inherited from Locke and Hutcheson, that obscures the fact. In the same manner as Pufendorf, he binds natural law to the rational utility of laws necessary for human social life. Once this is recognized, there remains no serious bar to taking Hume at his word, and accepting his account of justice as an account of the development of a natural law founded in rational reflection. The rules of justice are the nucleus of adventitious natural law. If this view is to be taken seriously, one question remains outstanding. What has happened to the Suum? Hume's theory makes no explicit appeal to the necessity of protecting a realm which is one's own, to which end the edifices of justice in political society naturally, justly tend. The short answer is that the Suum has been naturalized in just the same fashion as have the virtues. The inviolable realm of one's own is spelt out in terms of a natural, i.e., original motive, a motive which, but for the corrupting influence of the monkish virtues, would need no defense. This motive is self-love, a natural disposition to which Hume frequently returns in his account of justice and political order in both the treatise and the second inquiry. Thus he maintains, for example, that self-interest is the original motive to the establishment of justice. And, far from apologizing for the fact, he defends the importance of a healthy self-love or well-founded pride for social intercourse being both useful to ourselves and agreeable to others. There is no quality of the mind which is more indispensably requisite to procure the esteem and approbation of mankind. So, although the social virtues play a vital role in the formation of social existence by extending our originally limited affections, a measure of self-love is also important in firming up social relations by establishing mutual respect between persons. And it is self-love, the restricted concern for what is our own, that founds the jealous virtue of justice. If this suggestion is accepted, it is also possible to provide a tentative explanation for the absence of any overt appeal in Hume's account to other characteristic concepts of modern natural jurisprudence, such as individual rights and negative community. The rights of an individual are powers to act with moral effect, natural powers which are legitimately exercised, and concern the legitimacy of self-preservation, and thereafter those actions which tend to the improvement of human life. Hume can thus be understood to have bypassed the language of rights while preserving its essential content, in that his account of the origin of justice implicitly accepts the legitimacy of the natural desire for self-preservation and, through the generous sentiments of moral sense, similarly identifies a natural motive to promote utility. In the earliest stages of human life, the first of these desires is the more salient, since in the condition there is no social bounty of those goods necessary for survival. So the legitimate natural desire of the earliest human beings will be to take and directly make use of those goods which support life. In so doing, they will be treating the natural world as belonging to no one, and open for their use. To treat the natural desire for self-preservation as sufficient legitimation for original appropriation is thus to treat the original condition of the earth as a negative community. So Hume's psychological theses can be cashed out in terms of the secular theory of natural social order hinted at by Grotius.